Human Rights Watch is basically, with Amnesty, the two biggest organizations, if you're not from the human rights field, when it comes to human rights. Ken Roth is one of the people that inspired to do this work. From the very beginning, he's one of the most prominent human rights defender. I mean, I don't even have the words, right? The first time we held this, I fangirled for about 10 minutes before letting him speak, so I'll do it a bit less this time. But he was the executive director of Human Rights Watch for a very long time, and now is a professor at Princeton University. He also just published a book called Righting Wrongs that I recommend for everyone to order. I actually ordered mine and I'm waiting for it, on how we can actually, right the wrongs happening across the world. He's going to give a keynote speech on the fact that the battle between autocracy and democracy is a bit more complicated than we often think about. And then you'll have time for questions. So when I'm saying moderating, I'm not going to moderate the in-person room. We're going to let you ask questions directly. I'm going to moderate the online room. So for people on Zoom, ask all of your questions. I'm sorry, we're not bringing you in live. It's too complicated with the sound system, but I'll bring them to the room. Please give a big virtual and physical round of applause for Ken Roth. And yeah, it's amazing.
Well, thank you very much, Colin. Can you all hear me okay? Yes. I hope.
Sorry, it's working. Yes.
Okay, very good. Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I wasn't able to join you in person, but I'm in the middle of kind of a tour about my new book. And so I'm in London now and Amsterdam tomorrow, and it's been a bit of a crazy period. But I do encourage you to buy the book. I'm going to talk today on some of what's in the book. It obviously covers a lot of territory, but I thought that this would be the most appropriate issue to address you with. And as Colin mentioned, when people talk these days about the global contest between autocracy and democracy, people tend to assume that the autocrats are winning, that democracy is in decline. And I think they feel that because of Trump, because the AfD just did well in Germany, because Marine Le Pen is threatening to be the next president of France. But as Colin said, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, both more encouraging, but also more challenging. And so I thought I would explain that now, and then, welcome a conversation with you. So first, when I look at the world, I realize that if you happen to be an autocrat, I mean, imagine yourself sort of, sitting in the throne, the world is a very hostile place out there. And I'll say why I think that. First of all, it used to be that autocrats claimed that they could deliver better than democracies. Democracies were messy, they were divisive, they took time, whereas, a good autocrat could just order and get things done. And that was, a big selling point. But what we've seen in recent years particularly is that autocrats, because they don't allow free debate, because they don't allow free access to information, because they routinely surround themselves with sycophants who only tell the autocrat what they think that person wants to hear, and not, they don't challenge the autocrat, they don't introduce contrary ideas, they just try to placate the autocrat. That is a recipe for poor, indeed for disastrous decisions. And I say this, with the world's two most prominent autocrats being exhibits A and B of what can go wrong when you make decisions in a vacuum, when you decide things in an echo chamber where the only person you hear is basically yourself. So let's, start with Vladimir Putin. During his COVID-induced isolation, where he was reading history books and not talking to anybody who was giving him any independent ideas, he decided that it would be a great idea to invade Ukraine. It would be a piece of cake. It would be a cakewalk. They would be, in Kyiv in 3 days, and he would be able to snuff out this democracy that he saw as threatening because, Ukraine is a big Slavic country right on the border with Russia, and it shows the Russian people a model of democracy that they don't have, that they would like to have. And that's a dangerous model. So Putin, had to get rid of that. And he, invaded Ukraine thinking it'd be over with very quickly. And here we are 3 years later, not 3 days later. And it's a complete stalemate. Putin has been, throwing young men into the meat grinder, as they call it, treating them as cannon fodder, killing them off left and right, enormous costs, losing, massive amounts of Russian military materiel, and, meanwhile, destroying what's left of the Russian economy, which was already, basically, a large gas station. It didn't have a lot going for it. It was never diversified. But it is now, in deep trouble with inflation growing. They are, spending down their reserves. They are militarizing the economy. This is not a sustainable situation. And it's because nobody dared to question Putin. And, those outside the government who did were quickly arrested. Groups were shut down. My organization, Human Rights Watch, had an office in Moscow for 30 years. It was shut down. Same with every other human rights group, every other independent voice. And so that's how autocrats make bad decisions. Xi Jinping, pretty much the exact same thing. There was even less independent civil society or independent media in China than there was in Russia before the Ukraine war began. And, in China, Xi Jinping, again, has this, he loves pageantry. He'll have these, huge councils around him, all people dressed the exact same way, marching in unison, never dissenting, never voting against him. It's just, pageantry. It's not a deliberative chamber. And so again, Xi Jinping is making decisions for himself, by himself. And that's how you get, the Chinese economy being in deep trouble today, because Xi Jinping has been going after the most vibrant sectors of the economy, things like the tech sector, because he views it as too independent. He wants to control the vibrant parts of the economy. But, Chinese Communist Party control is a recipe for stagnation. The state-owned enterprises have never been the driving force of China's economy. So it is, stagnating at best, if not declining. Xi Jinping doesn't even trust consumer spending because he can't control consumers. So he views it as wasteful as opposed to state-directed investment. So these are just, two very visible examples of how autocrats serve themselves. And people have now seen that. So this glamour attached to autocracy, this view that autocrats deliver better, is now pretty widely discredited. And so if you, again, imagine yourself in the autocrat's chair and you look out there and what you see is a bunch of people who don't want you. And we've seen, evidence of this in the mass protests that have emerged in country after country after country, where people who live under autocracy make absolutely clear that they don't want it. They want democracy. We saw this in Hong Kong, in Thailand, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Iran, Russia, Belarus, Uganda, Poland, Nicaragua, Cuba, and I'm sure there are others that I'm forgetting. But, in many countries, well over a dozen countries in recent years, masses of people have taken to the street to stand for democracy, even at the risk of being arrested or conceivably shot. Now, they don't always prevail. We should recognize that. In Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, they overthrew, Sheikh Hasina, they overthrew the Rajapaksa dynasty. Other places, say Iran, the clerics are so brutal that they have suppressed the women life freedom protests. But, whether for the moment the autocrats cling to power or not, doesn't change the fact that the people in their country don't want them. And that's why I say it's a pretty hostile world out there. And so, yes, Putin can go to Kim Jong-un and say, send me troops so you can reinforce my disastrous war. He can go to China and say, keep buying my oil to finance my war. So the autocrats hang together. They all read from the same handbook, but they are not doing terribly well. So that's the good news. But so why are people saying, that autocracy is ascendant, that democracy is in decline? Ironically, it's because of the established democracies, largely in the West. And here we have seen in recent years more and more people willing to turn their backs on democracy, willing to contemplate an autocratic alternative. And you stand back and say, well, why is this happening? The reasons are pretty clear. You have people who are not, they don't feel that they're being served, excuse me, by a democratic government. These are the classic left behinds. They typically are living in rural areas or in smaller towns and cities and villages. They're not benefiting from the global economy. They're not benefiting from a higher education. They feel that democracy has come to mean rule by experts, and that these experts don't have the common person's welfare in mind, that they have been pushing kind of neoliberalism, they've been pushing a global economy, and that hasn't worked for some people. And so they feel that their concerns are not being served by the government, that they actually are not even being heard, that they're being almost disrespected, they're being looked down upon. In the United States, there's this joke about, flyover country, which is this ridiculous, term used for the bulk of the country, but that people fly over when they're, going from New York or Washington on the East Coast to San Francisco or Los Angeles on the West Coast. It's an incredibly disparaging term, and it sort of looks down on these people. And it was in that context that, a Trump comes along, and he is an anti-elite, an anti-expert. And people are saying, what's so great about democracy? And I'll try this guy out who is going to dump on the establishment. And is not clear what he's offering as an alternative, but the existing status quo isn't working for me. And so these left behinds are ripe for the autocratic appeal. And I think that the real challenge of our time is, yes, we have to keep fighting autocrats around the world. But there, I think we're pushing with the wind at our back because people see through the autocrats. But how do we reinforce, how do we bolster democracy where it has been established for a long time? And, in the West, most people have never lived under a dictatorship. So, they don't have a personal memory of it. They are sort of willing to use the autocratic scapegoating that is a big part of their appeal to their base. So, the autocrats typically don't really put forward a program. I mean, it's like Trump today who says, oh, I'm going to stop inflation and, imposes tariffs left and right, who is, cutting back the government services that actually many working class people need. So it's not as if Trump is actually serving them, but he has found good scapegoats. It's all the immigrants' fault. It's the immigrants who are driving up housing. It's the immigrants who are competing and preventing you from getting a better wage. It's the immigrants who are behind crime. And there doesn't have to be a lot of facts behind this, but it gives people a facile explanation for their hardship. And it prevents them from spending much time asking Trump or, the autocrat of the moment, so what are you going to do about it for me? Because the answer is not much. So I think that the challenge for us as we think about how do we reinforce democracy is severalfold. One is we do have to press democratic governments to do a better job of serving everybody. We have to recognize that the classic neoliberal formulas, the ritualistic endorsement of a global economy has brought great wealth to many people. I mean, there's no question about that, but it has left people behind. And we have to find a way to answer to those people and to say, oh, they'll just get another job. They can move, they can retrain. That's clearly not good enough for people who, may only know how to do one thing, who don't want to move from the place where they grow up. So we need governments that really do serve everybody better. We need also to attack the demagogueries, that is to say, to attack the scapegoating of disfavored minorities. And, it's always immigrants. I mean, that's always on the list. A lot of times it's gays, sometimes it's women who don't want to lead a traditional life, who don't want to go back to the 19th century. There's always something like this in the name of tradition, in the name of, how it used to be, the halcyon old days. And we need to show that, this is just scapegoating. It's not a substitute for a real political platform that serves everybody. But the other thing we have to do, and here I'm going to conclude on this, and I say this because, I think Atlas is sort of a member of progressive forces. And I think that, I could count myself among them. I think progressives also have to look at how we may have contributed to this. And what I mean by that is that we have had a tendency in recent years to operate overwhelmingly through identity politics. And there's a reason for that. There's identity politics is a way of saying, we know that there are certain people who have been discriminated against, who've been stigmatized, who have really been harmed by the existing system. And this could be because of racism, it could be because of Islamophobia, xenophobia, homophobia. And progressives tend to view the world through these identities that have been repressed and need to be sustained, need to, be backed as they push for their rights. And, so that's an important battle. I'm not disparaging that. But I think what we've been bad about doing is using a language that speaks for everybody. That is, we tend to conceive of politics these days as just a collection of individual interests, the different identities that we are promoting in our identity politics. And that does not include everybody. That's how Trump can come in and say, the white people in America are being persecuted. We're looking to South Africa. I mean, why did Trump just kicked out the South African ambassador to the United States? Because Trump loves to portray South Africa as, what's going to happen to the United States, how, whites are being persecuted, which isn't even true in South Africa. But he portrays it that way and says, if we don't kind of rein in DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, if we don't, stop all this concern with racism, we're going to be persecuting white people before you know it. And, he can do that because progressives have not been good about speaking about a national community where everybody has rights. And I say that not meaning nationalism. I don't want us to go out, fighting wars for the Italian nation or whatever. But I do want us to be able to recognize that we should be defending the rights of everyone who lives in our community, however you define that. But let's use the nation as the logical political boundary. And we have to find a way to, in a sense, almost embrace patriotism as meaning the rights of everybody. Not the rights of a coalition of individual interests, but the rights of everybody by virtue of their membership in that national community. And I think that, this is not a language that progressives have traditionally been using, not in recent years, but we need to recapture it because, the right has abandoned it. The right is saying, if you're in this disparaged white minority, we're looking out for your rights, but everybody else, we're tired of people talking about their rights. That's DEI. We're going to, unfund any agency that promotes that. So in a sense, the right is abandoning the field of believing in rights for everybody. I think progressives can capture that language, but we have to recognize we haven't been using it. And to do that more consistently will help to fight this demonization of disfavored minorities, which has been a key part of the autocrats' appeal to their base. So, to sum up again, I think autocracy looks pretty bad in the parts of the world where people are living under autocrats. Where people are living under democracy, there's a segment of our societies that, has had it. They feel that they're not being served. They are ripe for the autocrats' appeal, but we can counter that by getting democracy to serve them better and by clarifying that we stand for the rights of everybody in our communities, not just, the particular groups that we might be promoting, but really everybody. And we can, I think, recapture the essence of democracy, which is that it should serve everybody, it should be accountable to everybody, and it should be respectful of the rights of everybody. So I will stop there and very much welcome your questions and your comments.
This was amazing. I think we can all agree, right? Sorry, I'll go in front of the camera. And I love the idea of seeing autocrats being all lonely in their room, looking at the world and feeling, oh my God, no one wants me. I hope this is the case. I'm going to directly open it up for questions. So before I take the questions from online, anyone has questions? And don't be shy. I know you have one of the world's leading human rights advocates, but he actually is very happy to answer all of your craziest questions. I start with Yassine and then I come to Jovi.
Thank you very much. My question is very short and pretty simple. I can't seem to understand personally what the answer would be. What do we do if tomorrow we are met with millions of Ukrainians who say, hey, I want to be part of Russia?
Well, I mean, if they wanted that, fine. I think that's a counterfactual hypothetical. In other words, I think the Ukrainian people have made quite clear that they don't want to be. Zelensky, who represents, fighting Putin's invasion, has, the latest poll I saw is he's got 70% popularity. I mean, most leaders would die for that. So I don't think that's where we face. But look, at a democracy says that, if you really do have free debate and free discussion, and then you have a vote, I mean, governments can merge. It's not the end of the world. But it should be done freely, not coercively, not by virtue of invasion. So, if what you're suggesting is that that really was the case, you would have to respect that. I just don't think it's the case.
Hi, Kenneth. Thank you very much for the speech. I completely agree with what you said. I actually have so many questions for you, but we don't have the time, so we'll stick to one. I'm not sure it's the purpose of the event of today, but how can we challenge autocracies?
Okay, no, but that's a good question. And I actually think, I mean, there are two ways that I'll stress. I mean, one is that, autocrats survive by restricting people's ability to dissent. And so I think one thing that we do have to do is to try as much as we can to preserve the civic space so that dissent is possible. So there can be free debate, there can be, criticism, there can be discussion of alternatives. So as much as we can preserve that civic space, that's important. But the other thing that I think is important to do is to recognize that, autocrats, they can't just, maintain their power at the barrel of a gun. I mean, that's what Assad tried to do in Syria, and it's not a long-term solution. At some point, people are going to oust the autocrat. But autocrats try to pretend to be serving the people. And they want, just popular acquiescence to be a large part of why they're able to stay in power. So what is very helpful to do is to investigate and spotlight ways in which autocrats serve themselves. And so, when I was at Human Rights Watch, one of my favorite little projects was we looked at Hungary, at Viktor Orban, who is, Europe's probably most famous autocrat. And he, of course, claimed to serve the people. He would take these huge subsidies that he received from the European Union, and instead of, spending them on the people, he would build football stadiums. And you'd say, like, why is he doing that? Well, because football stadiums, whenever you build anything, you have to hire contractors. And the contractors he would hire would be his cronies. It was a way of paying off his cronies. And so, Hungary has all these, world-class football stadiums. When we then looked at, hospitals in Hungary, and the hospitals were decrepit. People would have to bring in their own toilet paper. I mean, they were just horrible. And so all that money, which could have been spent for the people, was spent, to shore up Orban's regime. And that kind of illustration of how autocrats serve themselves, not the people, really helps to discredit them. Another example today is in Egypt, where President Sisi has been pursuing this incredibly expensive vanity project of building a new administrative capital outside of Cairo. And who needs this? Nobody, but it's a way of, paying off the contractors again. Anytime you build something big, there's a lot of money to be spent for your friends. So while people are scrambling just to get tomorrow's breakfast, here's this massive vanity project. And that again is what happens when, Sisi has shut down the independent media, he's shut down civil society. He's created the most repressive environment in Egypt in its modern history. And when you have an unaccountable government, it serves itself. So this kind of exposure, and you can find this in any autocracy because they all are the same in that sense. This helps to discredit them. It helps to show what they're really about, and it helps to build popular opposition to their reign.
Thank you so much. I have 3 questions in the room, but first I'm going to take the ones online and let us know when we are out of time and we will wrap up. I have one question on autocrats and one on democracies, and it being a bit more complicated than it seems. Elisenda said, Ken mentioned that authoritarianisms are rarely truly questioned by those closest to them. As you know, in many cases, questioning them comes at the risk of imprisonment or even death. Given that they often silence dissent and surround themselves with those who reinforce their views, do you think they even have the introspection to recognize the widespread opposition they face? Or is their thirst for power so consuming, that they're completely indifferent to it? And I'm going to also ask you, I'm just reading for the ones in the room, but the one on democracy, so maybe you can answer both and then I give the mic to the room. So just for your background, Ken, this morning we talked a lot about how can democracies and authoritarian countries, but many democracies, be less hypocritical as well in the way they answer, right, to freedom struggles. And I think this is linked to this one, is how can governments reform the foreign policy that is based on condemning human rights violations, colonialism, and imperialism by all countries? I think what Yobi also is linking at or hinting at is, and this is no longer working, to try. Hello?
I can hear you.
We can't hear Ken either, so this is up here. Sorry, is it working?
Yeah.
He's hearing us?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. But so basically this morning we talked a lot about this, we had a lot of discussions around which freedom struggles do we support, which ones do we not support, how do we start standing by freedom systematically? And I think it was also linked to, how can we reform foreign policy so that it's less imperialistic, colonialistic, and condemns human rights violations systematically? I'll let you get started with those two very big questions. And if you have a minute more, we have a couple of questions in the room again.
Okay. Well, first, I mean, do autocrats, living in their sycophantic bubble know that the public doesn't like them? Absolutely. I mean, look at Putin. Putin is terrified of what he calls color revolutions. That was, his original reason for invading Ukraine back in 2014, because there was a popular uprising against Yanukovych, which was his pawn, because Yanukovych didn't want to get closer to the European Union. And the Ukrainian people said, well, we do. So you're out of here. Go back to the Kremlin where you came from. And we want a president who's going to lead us. And there have been similar, popular revolutions in Georgia, and I mean, a number of countries. Putin is super aware of this. And I think, his primary goal in life is to avoid a color revolution in Russia. Because, he not only would lose power, but he could end up in prison or killed. And so I think that, most autocrats are going through life completely wary of their people. They're trying to fool the people into thinking that they're being served. But if they weren't so afraid of their people, they would allow free speech. They would allow free debate. They don't, because they realize that that's a recipe for public discontent exploding and ousting the autocrat. So I just think that it's almost inherent in being an autocrat that you are terrified of the people. You know that if they're given a chance, they get rid of you. And so that's why you suppress them. Now, in terms of foreign policy, I mean, the premise of the question is 100% accurate, that yes, there's incredible double standards in Western foreign policy. I think it's been most epitomized recently by the contrast between, the reaction to Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the reaction to, Netanyahu's bombing and starving of Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Just 180-degree polar difference. And, the sad thing is people see through this. It very much does discredit the ability of Western governments to promote human rights when there's such a blatant Israel exception to the defense of human rights, or an exception for, this or that ally. And so, what can we do? I think that, we, on the one hand, need to spotlight the abuses themselves. So, really documenting what's going on in Gaza. How are people, why are 90% of the people displaced? Their homes destroyed. What was this indiscriminate bombardment, this disproportionate attacks, and really describing these war crimes, describing the genocide. That's important to do. But we also need to press, governments that purport to promote human rights to close their blind spots, to sort of be more principled. And this is not a new phenomenon. I mean, as long as I've been doing this work, governments have been selective in their enforcement of human rights. The only way to push them in the right direction is to point out the hypocrisy and to embarrass them in the media. And that doesn't always succeed, but it is an important force to drive them to be more consistent in their respect for human rights, not only at home, but also in their foreign policy.
Hello, Kate. Kenneth, I have a question for you. How do you see also the raising of the extreme right parties in Europe? And how do you think this is linked to the fear that people have in general of the problems that we see raising in Europe, in the US, and everywhere? And what do you think is the right sentiment that democracy should really advocate? Thank you.
And because I'm conscious of your time, I'm going to ask the last two questions to be set together so you can package it however you want before you have to go on to your book tour.
Okay.
I think you had a question and you had a question.
Hi, thank you so much for your intervention. I was wondering, how does one classify countries among democracies and autocracies? And what was the role of the defense of human rights played in that classification? Because, I mean, I study political science, and we learned that democracies are mainly defined by the presence of free elections and checks and balances. But all of these, for example, are present in the case of Israel, which we call the only democracy in the Middle East. And obviously seeing like recent events, but also history-wise, I was wondering, are checks and balances and free elections enough to define a democracy? And can Israel still be considered a democracy as citizens, like Arab citizens and Jewish citizens, don't have the same rights?
Thank you. And last question.
Yes. Quite connected to this one. Today, in the discussion of the morning, it's come out that direct democracy can, in a way, improve the situation of the crisis of democracy. And the question is it is, and maybe this crisis of the representative democracy could not be predictable properly because it's a system that is now a long time in charge, but doesn't have any innovation, especially in the Western countries.
Okay, well, let me take the last question first. I mean, direct democracy, I just didn't think it's practical when you've got a huge country. So, I mean, you can have referenda for certain things, but I don't think there's a real practical alternative to representative democracy when you've got a country of millions and millions of people. So I'm not quite sure what's proposed there, but direct democracy is fine if you have a village or a small number. In terms of the question of the European far right, I mean, what I said about Trump is completely true for the European far right. Again, it's appealing to typically people who feel left behind. The AfD in Germany, its main source of support is in what used to be Eastern Germany, where people are not benefiting from reunification in the way that they had hoped. They feel very unequal compared to people who live in what had been Western Germany. And so it's the same phenomenon. And I think that we need to push any government to ensure that it is serving everybody on its territory and that people don't feel left behind, because it's those left behinds that are increasingly willing to just upend the system and go with some right-wing demagogue who promises the moon, but typically won't deliver. Now, on the question of, how do you classify? I mean, I think of democracy as really having essentially three things. I mean, one is periodic elections. Second is the rule of law, which means that even senior government officials are subject to the law. They're not above the law. And third is respect for rights, which is where your checks and balances come in, because if you do have rights, then you have political parties, you have an independent media, you have civic groups, you have lots of checks on the government quite apart from just the division between the executive and legislative and judicial branches of government. So, that for me is key. I think we have to recognize that the spectrum between democracy and autocracy is a continuum. It's not a strict black and white. And so we still see, places like Hungary or Turkey that try to have managed elections, but they still hold elections. They try to tilt the playing field by restricting independent media, by arresting opposition figures, but they still allow people to go to a vote, and they pretty much count up the vote fairly at that stage. But they just want to tilt the playing field enough so they think they'll always win. But that's a very risky endeavor. Orban and Erdogan have found out that in recent elections they've lost, local elections big time. I mean, Orban lost the three biggest cities of Turkey, Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir. Erdogan did. Orban lost again, Budapest and most of the big cities of Hungary. So it's a risky endeavor having these managed elections because you may not manage it enough, which is why so many autocrats are dispensing with anything that's even vaguely credible. They're just having electoral charades, which they're guaranteed to win because there's no real opposition, but they don't confer any legitimacy because they're so obviously charades. But we have to be kind of aware that there's this movement toward these electoral charades away from managed democracy. But, all of these exist on a continuum of autocracy. None of that is really a free and fair election. Now, your question on Israel, I mean, there is systematic discrimination against Israeli Arabs, but I think Israel still is a democracy within the Green Line, within its pre-1967 borders. It obviously is not a democracy in the occupied territory, and there it's imposing apartheid on the Palestinians of the occupied territory. That doesn't stop it from being a democracy, within its original territorial unit. It just means that it's a democracy that's committing war crimes and arguably genocide in the occupied territory. So, we know that democracies can commit serious crimes. I mean, think back to the United States with George W. Bush. The United States was certainly a democracy, but he was torturing people. He was throwing people in Guantanamo. So I think as long as we kind of recognize that democracies can commit very serious violations of human rights, that doesn't stop them from being democracies so long as they, allow the requisites within their territory of periodic elections, the rule of law, and respect for rights. Israel is just a case where that's not the case outside of its territory.
Wonderful. Ken, we thank you once again. A pleasure, an honor to have you with us. Feel free to drop. We will move on with our next sessions here with the people in the room. We will have, and also online. Right, okay. Yes.
Great seeing you.
One more round of applause, please.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Are you ready? So, some action. We are now in that part of